What's the father of the man responsible for the Orlando massacre doing at a Hillary Clinton rally?
The man we've spotlighted in the crowd is former Congressman Mark Foley.
The two campaigns are also being questioned over a couple of people spotted at their campaign rallies.
Look who's right behind Clinton at this Florida rally.
Blagojevich.
Right there, spotted in the crowd, standing behind Hillary Clinton.
Trump had an unexpected supporter of his own.
Another controversial guest was spotted at a campaign rally, but this time it was at a Trump event.
Trump's campaign released a statement on Tuesday saying it disavows his support.
Don't often see Zelig with Forrest Gump. Greetings from the great city of Angels. On our program tonight, Hillary Clinton takes her turn at an economic sales pitch. She visited a suburb of Detroit today to offer her rebuttal to Donald Trump's big speech on the economy from Monday. We've heard many of the Clinton proposals before. Her plan includes investing billions in new infrastructure spending, tuition-free in-state college for middle-class families, and she wants to establish an exit tax for companies that are trying to move abroad. And while Hillary Clinton spent some of her remarks trashing Trump's proposals, a lot of what she did today was a more upbeat, optimistic set of ideas for the nation's economy.
Now, we have a lot of urgent and important work to do, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Because all the people that I have met throughout this campaign really prove how wrong this negative, pessimistic view is. America's best days are still ahead of us if we make up our minds to actually go out and make that happen. Starting on day one, we will work with both parties to pass the biggest investment in new, good-paying jobs since World War II. Trump would roll back the tough rules that we have imposed on the financial industry. I'll do the opposite. I think we should strengthen those rules so Wall Street can never wreck Main Street again. And then there's the estate tax, which Trump wants to eliminate altogether. Now, if you believe that he's as wealthy as he says, that alone would save the Trump family $4 billion. It would do nothing for 99.8% of Americans. So they'd get a $4 billion tax cut, and 99.8% of Americans would get nothing. Just think of what we could do with those $4 billion. We could pay for more than 47,000 veterans to get a four-year college degree. We could provide a year's worth of health care to nearly 3 million kids.
Trump also weighing in on the economy today after getting criticized last week for releasing a list of economic advisors that contained all men. Trump's campaign expanded that list today by adding 8 women to his advisory council. The Trump campaign also put out a statement before Clinton's speech that read in part, quote, Hillary Clinton is running to keep things as they are. Clinton's plans today will short-circuit our economy by raising taxes, increasing spending, and killing jobs. So, Donnie, there's a lot in Hillary Clinton's speech, but overall, 30,000 speech. Did she propose some good policies? And was what she did and how she said it good politics?
Let me start with the good politics. What I thought was fantastic about the politics was basically she picked up the tone of the convention of the Democrats, whereas in Trump's economic speech a few days ago, he was still the bleak and the dark. And I think this election has become a referendum on who do we think we are as a country. So, you know, there was an optimistic tone, which I think was strong. Look, it was Democrats 101, just like Trump's was Republican 101 from an economic point of view. What I think was strong about her speech was she pivoted very strong into Trump. I still, for the life of me, cannot figure out why they included that estate tax benefit. It just is such an easy target for the rich. And the way she quantified it and basically said, you know what, he's going to save $4 billion from it, to me, it's an easy target. She was jobs, she was infrastructure, she was small business, 101, meat and potatoes, but very effective on attacking Trump.
Yeah. On the politics, you know, it's part of the current Clinton strategy of don't take a lot of risks. Keep the Democratic base together. Highlight areas where Trump is either on defense or has taken controversial positions, as you suggested, for instance, on the estate tax, which only affects the very, very wealthiest right now. On the policies, I think you'd be hard-pressed to hear that speech and have a great deal of confidence that this is a person who totally gets how to turn the economy around after 8 years of pretty sluggish growth. But as I said, she's not interested in taking risks right now, and I thought she pretty effectively ended the day with that speech, putting Trump somewhat on the defensive and not opening herself up to any obvious attacks that weren't strictly partisan.
To me, you made the key point there. Everything she does at this point should almost make her as invisible as possible. That speech fades into the woodwork. There was nothing in it that was, going to provoke any new thinking. There was also nothing in it that was going to raise any eyebrows. Every day that goes by that shifts back to Trump, whether it's things he's saying, whether it's his economic policies, she wins. So I think for what she tried to accomplish today, I think it was a winning day for her.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more in the next block about the speech, including whether the speech was pure liberal or whether she took any centrist positions or not. But I will say her ability to make arguments now and get a lot of coverage is pretty limited because Trump, as we're about to discuss, is still taking up a lot of space.
Speaking of Donald J. Trump, billionaire, he's again taking heat for something he said at a campaign rally. This one happened last night in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, when the Republican nominee made his remarks a little extra Trumpy by claiming that President Obama and Hillary Clinton co-founded the terrorist organization Islamic State. Trump has since passed up several opportunities to walk back or clarify this hyperbole, but all day today, including at one rally this morning in Miami Beach, the Donald doubled down.
I call President Obama and Hillary Clinton the founders of ISIS. They're the founders. In fact, I think we'll give Hillary Clinton the, if you're on a sports team, most valuable player, MVP. You get the MVP award. ISIS will hand her the most valuable player award. Her only competition is Barack Obama between the two.
All right, Democrats continue to jump on this remark, including the Clinton campaign, which put out a statement from policy advisor Jake Sullivan that read in part, quote, "This is another example of Donald Trump trash-talking the United States. He's echoing the talking points of Putin and our adversaries to attack American leaders and attack American interests while failing to offer any serious plans to confront terrorism or make this country more secure." Also this morning in a radio interview with Hugh Hewitt, Trump opened up a bit and explained why he's taking this very intentional, very controversial approach.
I think I would say they lost the peace. They created the Libyan vacuum. They created the vacuum into which ISIS came, but they didn't create ISIS. That's what I would say. So I just use different language to communicate about
But they wouldn't talk about your language, and they do talk about my language, right?
Oh, good point.
Mark, this is now kind of post-defense. I'm aware of what I'm doing, and I'm doing it just to stir the pot. When I watch his speech, to me, I don't think that's premeditated. I think it's just, one more dropping he leaves on the floor. Do you think this defense of Trump is a good one?
I think it's a mistake at this point in the campaign. I understand he likes to dominate the news. I understand he can look back at his history on the national stage and see that when he's a provocative showman, when he says things that literally no one else would say on the national stage, he gets more attention. But right now, his biggest two problems, I think, is showing the filter and the American people that he's got the temperament to be president, and that he creates news in areas that really help him. And I don't think either of those two things are achieved by making the kind of overtop statement he made.
I agree. If you go one level deeper, he actually contradicted what his campaign people said he was really saying. If what he was really saying was just, hey, I'm trying to galvanize, the Second Amendment people and get them out to vote, well, then there's nothing that would create controversy. And he's admitting he wants to say controversial things. So in a strange way, he's de facto admitting the very things we were concerned he was saying actually were.
Yeah, although he's not admitting it applied in that case, but I take your point. He does think he can beat Hillary Clinton on foreign policy, despite the fact that she was Secretary of State. I just don't think being this provocative, when, as you just suggested, he's acknowledging he was doing it to be provocative, is the way to get people to focus on the actual substance of his charge. He's got to be confident that his ideas are strong enough that they can get attention, not just using over-the-top rhetoric that, again, literally no one else would use.
The one thing he has in his favor at this point is Trump fatigue, and no matter what he says, I don't think it even raises that many eyebrows anymore.
Yeah, this just raised some. All right, going to take a break, come back, because we're going to have more from Hillary Clinton's economic speech today after these words from our sponsors. Let's take now what they call in the TV business a closer look at Hillary Clinton's economic speech. She made it today at a factory in Warren, Michigan. Let's start with the parts where she seemed to go out of her way to empathize with working class voters and the daily struggles they face.
There is too much inequality, too little upward mobility. It is just too hard to get ahead today. But there are common sense things that your government could do that would give Americans more opportunities to succeed. Why don't we do it? Because powerful special interests and the tendency to put ideology ahead of political progress have led to gridlock in Congress. And how can you not be frustrated and even angry when you see nothing getting done? And a lot of people feel no one is on their side and no one has their back. And that is not how it's supposed to be in America. If I am fortunate enough to be your president, I will have your back every single day that I serve.
Donnie, that could have been Bernie Sanders. It could have been Donald Trump. Republicans are trying to paint her as out of touch. How'd she do today in coming across as someone who gets the struggles of working class people?
I think she's staying at 10,000 feet up. Once again, 101. You and I could have written that speech. There was nothing in there. And strangely enough, that's the good news for her. Because once again, every day that goes by, that there's nothing that kind of comes through in any way that's critical about her and shifts it back to Trump. I find it interesting. I would have moved her a little to the middle. I want to do it just a simple math here. Is that if you go on the premise that 70 to 80% of Bernie voters are going to go to Hillary at this point, let's say you start to say things that maybe even turn a few of them off. And I think if they leave her, they go to an independent. That's a net -1. But anything that she says that would draw a Republican in away from Trump, that's a net +2 because she gets one and Trump loses one. So I would have moved her a little bit more to the center, but I still think all in all it was a good day for her.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no doubt that she gets working class people better than her image and better than the Republicans say she does. I still think her biggest weakness as a candidate, and my biggest worry if she got elected for uniting the country and moving an agenda, is she just doesn't give off a sense, not just of understanding working class people, but having an integrated sense of how the economy can work in the current age. And I just think today was a big opportunity to do that. She didn't turn the speech fully, as she has in some past quote-unquote policy speeches, into just an attack on Trump. She made an effort to lay out her theory of the case on the economy, and I didn't come away any more understanding it than I think probably most people who would have listened to it or excerpts of it.
You're right. You said you said 2 words, risk averse, and I think that's the strategy, and she showed it today. Clinton's speech was primarily all about big, pretty standard Democratic spending programs that her left-leaning fans will love, but there was one part that seemed directly aimed at wooing more centrist voters. Let's take a look at that.
Here's something that you don't always hear enough of from Democrats. A big part of our plan will be unleashing the power of the private sector to create more jobs at higher pay. Right now, the smallest businesses, the kind that my dad had, because it was a really small business, spend 20 times more per employee to prepare their taxes compared to larger companies. It should be as easy as printing out a bank statement. Let's free entrepreneurs to do what they do best, innovate, grow, and hire.
Mark, is the safe place, if you want to go centrist, but really, really not make the move, you use the words either small business or entrepreneurs, because that straddles both the ode to capitalism and business, but yet it's the little guy in the shoe shop. So in a strange way, that's the easiest way to kind of blanket and say, no, I'm somewhere in the middle.
Dennis Kucinich could have said that stuff. This is yet another indication of the fact that she's running as someone from the far left, doesn't feel, as you suggested before, she needs to take the center back in any serious way, doesn't feel she needs to take the party on, her own party on in any serious way. And while she's out there courting Republicans on both national security and domestic office holders, it's clear that on policy, she's very comfortable running center left and not doing anything, as her husband did, as Barack Obama did, to say to the party in a serious policy-oriented way, we need to make some changes.
I think the fact that Trump has gone very, very traditional Republican and has gone from 35 to 15 on the business tax, has done the estate tax, allows her to stay populist and doesn't have to move from there.
Yeah. All right, finally, let's look at one other piece of Clinton's speech, this one on trade policy. She continues to very clearly distance herself from President Obama and not to cede any ground on this issue to Donald J. Trump.
I will stop any trade deal that kills jobs or holds down wages, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I oppose it now, I'll oppose it after the election, and I'll oppose it as president.
So, Donnie, there are people in Michigan who care about free trade. There are people who'd like the TPP to pass, but it seems pretty obvious she is trying to convince everybody that this is her position and Trump's not going to get to the populist left of her on trade.
Yeah, that once again, you stop the average person on the street and ask what TPP is, and they might think it's a new rap band or something, but everybody knows it's a bad word right now. And that takes away Trump's flank as far as, Trump, the anti-free trade guy. It's a set of words she puts out there. Obviously, we know the story. Originally, she was for it. Now she's against it. So once again, I'm going to repeat myself. She put the poo-poo platter out there. If I'm looking for somebody to be provocative, if I'm looking for somebody to move the needle, I'm not seeing it. If I'm looking for someone to stay under the radar and let Trump self-destruct, that's what she did today.
Yep, playing it safe. All right, up next, how down-ballot Republicans and down-ballot Democrats are dealing with the Trump factor in competitive races. We'll have that for you right after this. And down the ballot, Donald Trump has scrambled just about everything that could possibly be scrambled in this election. In Ohio, for instance, the state where their popular sitting Republican governor refuses to endorse his party's nominee for president, both parties' Senate candidates are blowing up the typical turnout strategies and building new alliances as they try to appeal to voting members of the other party. In a new poll from NBC News, The Wall Street Journal, and Marist, incumbent Republican Senator Rob Portman leads his Democratic challenger Ted Strickland by 5 points, 48 to 43. It's a close race, which might be part of the reason why Strickland, the Democrat, has started running an extraordinary TV ad that highlights his biography, but also leans heavily on issues that might as well be straight out of Donald Trump's mouth.
The first in his family to go to college, his dad worked in a steel mill. His brothers finished concrete. That's why he's fought against every bad trade deal, from NAFTA to most favored nation status for China. Now Ted Strickland is running for the U.S. Senate, calling for a moratorium on all new trade deals until we can prove they'll create American jobs.
I came from a working class family. I will always fight to make sure that working people have a fair shot.
Ted Strickland, Ohio, heart and soul.
So that's the Democratic challenger trying to appeal to Trump voters. On the other side, incumbent Senator Portman and the Ohio Republican Party are making a concerted effort to turn out moderate Democrats and other Ohio voters who, if Trump ends up not winning, would be the ones most likely to vote a split ticket vote for Clinton and Portman. Joining us now to talk about this dynamic and Senator Portman's efforts is Washington Post reporter Karen Tumulty, who wrote an article about all of this for the paper and here in the last news cycle. Joins us from the Post newsroom. Karen, thanks for coming on.
Great to be here.
What is unusual about the tactics that Senator Portman and the Ohio Republican Party are using to try to find and motivate Clinton voters or other Democrats?
Well, the most unusual thing I found was that after the Democratic convention, when Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine took their big swing through Ohio, Portman's campaign actually dispatched volunteers to go to Clinton and Kaine events to hand out literature that touted his endorsement by unions that normally go for the Democrats, like the Teamsters. They were posting things on their Facebook and Twitter pages. You know, here are our volunteers at the Clinton rally. So it is rather extraordinary. But as you said, those poll numbers would suggest that it's working for Portman. A month ago, both the presidential race and the Senate race, that same NBC Wall Street Journal Marist poll showed tied. In this case, there's a 5-point lead that's opened up for Clinton and a 5-point lead that's opened up for Portman.
Portman has got some moderate positions, most prominently probably coming out for same-sex marriage a few years ago. What makes the Portman campaign think that this can work, given that all the literature and academia shows that ticket splitting isn't that common anymore?
Well, it isn't that common. And in fact, in 2012, it was as low as it had been in 90 years. It was in more than 90 years. Only 6% of congressional districts in this entire country voted one way for their House member and another way for president. But a lot of people are arguing that that trend could actually could change this year, in part because Donald Trump is so unpopular. And a lot of Republicans, a lot of moderate voters, for the first time in a long time, people are talking about strategic voting, which is almost like the unicorn of politics. It's where you vote for one party for president and you vote for the other party as a break on the president. Yeah. So they are counting on the fact that essentially both tickets are headed up by relatively unpopular people, which scrambles everything all the way down the ballot.
Yeah, it's Donnie, picking up from your article, I think 6% of congressional districts went the opposite way of the presidency in 2012, and going back to 72 was 44%. I think there's going to be a landslide direction in split ticket for the exact reason you said, because even the folks voting for Hillary, they're doing it begrudgingly. And I think there's something emotional that's going to happen in the voting booth, both candidates, because no matter which way you vote, most people are voting begrudgingly and go, you know, screw it, I don't care, and just as a reflection go the other side on the lever. And I think we're going to see that in record proportions here.
Now, of course, the wild card is that people just may be so turned off by this election they don't show up at all. And that could also hurt somebody like Portman in Ohio, because it's most likely to be the moderate Republicans who don't show up at the polls. But, you know, in Ohio has not voted split ticket in a Senate race and a presidential race since 1988, when they voted for George Herbert Walker Bush for president and Howard Metzenbaum for the Senate. So Portman is definitely running against recent history here.
So in Ohio, as we said, we see Portman and Strickland, the challenger, both trying to look for crossover appeal. There are other competitive Senate races where these dynamics might also be in play. Take Pennsylvania, for instance, where their new NBC News Wall Street Journal Marist poll there shows the Republican incumbent Pat Toomey is trailing his Democratic challenger Katie McGinty, but just by 4 points in a race that Republicans have long known would be a problem. Florida, there's a new Quinnipiac poll that shows the former presidential candidate, incumbent Senator Marco Rubio, now running for re-election to his Senate seat, leading the Democratic challenger Patrick Murphy by 3 points, 48-45. And in New Hampshire, a recent WBUR poll shows the Republican incumbent Kelly Ayotte is down 10 points to Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan. So, Karen, real quick, will other Republicans, rather, you think, be tempted to do what Portman has done and try to find Democratic votes to save themselves?
They absolutely have no choice. But the problem becomes when you have a situation like New Hampshire, if the bottom just flat out drops out of the presidential nominee, Donald Trump, you do find yourself in a sort of Kelly Ayotte situation where even if you're outperforming him, you're pretty far behind.
Yeah. Okay. Karen Tumble to the Washington Post. Great piece. It's on WashingtonPost.com right now. Karen, thanks so much. When we come back, we're going to talk about Donald Trump's latest trip to the cover of Time magazine and why the patience of some Republican leaders might just be wearing thin. We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome back. We're joined now by two men who are on opposite sides of the aisle and now opposite sides of our set. Democratic pollster and partner at the Global Strategy Group, Nick Gorovich, and President of Americans for Prosperity, Tim Phillips. Tim, Nick, thanks for joining the show. Let's start. Interesting Time magazine cover today about Mr. Trump. Basically, I don't know if we have an image of that cover of him kind of falling apart, if you will. I want to turn to you. One of the things in that story that was interesting is that, according to some insiders there, that people are telling Trump, you've got to take the gloves off. And he's saying, well, Reince Priebus is holding me back. What would that mean? Because his gloves, calling the president the founder of ISIS and suggesting that Hillary Clinton be assassinated, seems to be kind of gloves off to me. So where do they want him to go?
I would hope they're sending him toward the issues to actually talk about the problems of this economy and how they can be fixed. I hope that's where they're going, because that actually would offer a path to some kind of success, but not with the personal stuff.
But that's the opposite of taking the gloves off. That's staying on message. I want to bring you in. We're coming off back-to-back days of yesterday suggesting that our president and the woman running for president are co-founders of ISIS. Day before, assassinated Hillary Clinton. If you are running Hillary's campaign at this point, do you agree with me? Do everything you can to just stay under the covers and let Trump dominate every news cycle?
Well, I work for Priorities USA, which is the super PAC supporting Hillary. So, what we're doing is we're talking about how Donald Trump is uniquely unqualified and unfit to be president. He's dangerous. He's out there saying incredibly dangerous and harmful things. The Clinton campaign every day is out there putting a perspective, optimistic vision for the country forward, and I think the voters will decide who's better.
Tim, between now and Labor Day, Tim, between now and Labor Day, what's realistic for the Trump campaign to get done in terms of their standing in the polls and any other metric you'd want to use?
I think if they get back to the issues at some point, there's hope for the Republicans this year, certainly down ballot especially. Voters don't like either nominee. That's very clear. Hillary's numbers are negative 60% plus on her unfavorables. And when you look at where Americans are, 2/3 of Americans think this country's on the wrong track, predominantly because of this weak economy under the last 7 years of Obama. So there is a roadmap. And I think these Senate Republicans are actually going to survive this year because of what I just laid out.
Nick, do you agree with what Donnie and I said earlier, that Hillary Clinton seems to be largely trying to play it safe these days? And if you do agree, is that unambiguously a smart strategy?
Again, I don't think she's trying to play it safe. I think she's out there trying to talk about the issues. I think that's where Tim and I agree, is that we think that the candidate should be out there talking about the issues. But I think Donald Trump is incapable of talking about the issues. He, attempted to pivot to the economy on Monday. And then by Monday night and Tuesday, he was talking about the President of the United States being a terrorist and inciting violence against his opponent. So, look, I think she's doing the right thing. She's trying to keep it about her vision for the country. Again, Tim and I might disagree on what those visions are and where we should take the country, but I think she's the only candidate in the race who's attempting to do that right now.
Nick, in Philadelphia, Joel Benenson, who Hillary Clinton's strategist and pollster, said he thought Trump's floor in the popular vote nationally was 40%. Under worst case, do you think that is the floor for Trump, or could he be lower?
I think, I think that's about right. I think right now he's alienating members of his own party. You see Republican women sort of fleeing in droves, and we've got, other candidates out there, third-party candidates who I could see Republican voters turning to. So, I think that remains to be seen. There's currently a core support for Trump out there, but, he's playing with the floor right now.
Hey, Tim, in our previous segment, we were talking about split ticket. At what point do the lemmings start to go over the cliff? At what point do the folks that are sitting there with their hands on their lap right now, sticking with Trump, say, you know what, it's survival of the fittest right now, we've got to get off? Do you see a moment in time? Is it after a first debate if it doesn't go well? Is it a certain poll number?
I think it is a debate. I think a lot of folks, I bet the record attendance or viewership for debate will be reached in that debate. I can tell you the good news, I mentioned Senate Republicans and ticket splitting, Donnie, just a moment ago. The good news is most voters out there are differentiating between the Republican nominee for president and these Senate Republicans and House Republicans. And so I think that gives them an opportunity to make their case on the issues and to win in a very difficult environment. A place like Pennsylvania with Pat Toomey, where, Obama won by over 400,000 votes in 2012, where Hillary has a significant lead right now. That's a place where Pat Toomey is holding neck and neck with McGinty and can win that race.
Nick, as somebody running a super PAC for Hillary, two dirty words or two dirty sounds, email. We're going to be doing a piece coming up, that New York Times piece, about possibly more to come with a lot of Hillary folks getting into their emails. Is there any kind of proactive strategic work going on, anticipating, hey, look, this is the tip of the iceberg, this is how we're going to play it, we're going to set up a conspiracy theory, what it is, because that could be the smoking gun?
Yeah, look, I legally can't coordinate with the campaign, so I'm sure they have strategies that they're pushing. A lot of the sort of conspiracy theories right now are being pushed by folks who have been attacking the Clintons since the 1990s on this issue. The sort of entire campaign against Clinton has been focused on emails, and we have about 75 things that Donald Trump is saying that is making him uniquely unfit to be president of the United States, and that's what we're going to focus on as well.
I want to pick
Nick,
up.
do you think Democrats, office holders, and others are bothered by what Hillary Clinton did with their emails and just are being quiet for political expediency, or are Democrats not bothered by what she did?
Look, I think Democrats widely, remember that line in the debate with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, we're tired of the emails. I think that's how Democrats feel a little bit. We get that it's a concern, and Hillary herself has said that she would have done things differently, but I think voters are ready to move on, talk about real issues, and I think that's what the campaign is doing.
Well, since you're a Democrat and you're the one here, I'll put you on the spot. Are you troubled by the degree to which she exposed sensitive information to being hacked?
No, again, I think there's always a way to look backwards and do things differently, but I think we're trying to move on and talk about the issues facing voters in their lives.
Tim, if you were advising...
Well, again, let me just ask you, Donnie, let me just go again, just because I want to clarify. I didn't really get from your answer whether you were troubled by the degree to which she exposed sensitive information. Did that trouble you, what she did? Would it trouble you if a Republican had done that?
You know, I don't think so. You know, I'm not. You know, what my personal belief is not incredibly important here. I think, you know, I think that the campaign has been very clear on this. You know, that they personally, that Hillary herself would have done things differently. But you know, we're trying to move on.
Tim, I'm going to turn that chair into the chief Trump advisor chair. And
no, please don't put it there.
And it's the day after he's done a Trump, and he basically said that our commander-in-chief is the founder of ISIS, and he goes on Hugh Hewitt this morning and says, well, kind of that's the way I do things. I like to, you know, to say provocative things. What would the strategy be for you for what I call always the day after Trump? Do you agree with him doubling down? Do you just come right out and say, I'm sorry? Do you say it never happened? What is the playbook?
Get to the economy. I'm telling you.
No, but you have to now acknowledge that it's the next day.
Right.
And he comes to office and he's in his bathrobe and he's all tired. He just woke up. And you say, Donald, you did it again, dude. What would you tell him to do?
I'm telling you, I would tell him to drop this stuff and get to the economy. This is an economy.
No, I'm talking about how to handle. Well, he's got to now answer for what he did the day before.
No, his strategy. I mean, Hillary Clinton's not answering
the press is not going to let him alone.
Disastrous email.
Well, the press is not going to let him alone. He's got to when he says, Donald, did you mean that? What would be the correct response?
Move on to the economy. I'm just Donnie, move on to the economy. This is an economy that is failing. 94 million Americans out of the workforce. You have the slowest economic growth for a so-called recovery in modern American history. Americans are not happy. And they're not happy because this economy is not working for them, especially for the folks who are struggling at the bottom rungs of the ladder. There's an opening. I think it's why a lot of Senate Republicans are going to survive, and I would urge the Republican nominee to do just that. Actually lay out an agenda, explain where the Obama-Clinton years have failed this country on the economy. And it's interesting. The president's personal approval numbers have been creeping up, and good for him. But the right track, wrong track is still a disaster. 2/3 of Americans, Donnie, say we're on the wrong track. That's predominantly
which obviously contradicts the 52% approval rate. Can I ask you one question before we go?
Doesn't contradict it. It's a nuance that's worth explaining.
Trump advocate, where did Chris Christie go? Anybody notice? We haven't heard from Chris Christie. He should be out there. He should be the #1 biter of Hillary Clinton.
I do think Mike Pence is doing a nice job for them. I think he puts forward a different kind of look for their ticket. I think it helps helpful for them.
Appreciate it, guys. Tim Phillips, Nick Gorovich, thank you both. When we come back, a political hack, literally. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can now listen to us on radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We will be right back.
Welcome back. I'm still in Los Angeles. Donnie's still in New York, and joining us now, a New York Times reporter. The paper's reporting that the Democratic Party data breach that's been in the news for a couple weeks, believed to be done by Russian hackers, has in fact been more pervasive than previously thought. Officials told the paper the cyber attack breached the private email accounts of more than 100 party officials, and that the target, at least amongst the targets, Hillary Clinton's campaign staffers. Democrats are now worried that more damaging messages are going to surface between now and November in public. Here to talk about all this, one of the journalists behind the New York Times story, Times reporter Eric Lichtblau. Eric, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Mark. How are you?
Good. So this story has been in the news for a couple weeks. Just put a finer point on the intro there. What are you two, your paper, you and your colleague reporting that is new and for Democrats troubling?
Well, basically, it's even bigger and even worse than I thought. I mean, we knew a couple of weeks ago when the WikiLeaks trove of about 20,000 emails came out that the DNC had been hacked and the DCCC, which is the House fundraising arm, had also been hacked. It looks like it went well beyond that. The FBI has started giving briefings to the intelligence committees. They're putting some numbers on this that, you know, at least 100 accounts of personal and private emails, and that number could very well go up. So you're talking about material that's you know, even more personal and potentially even more damaging, and Democrats are kind of scrubbing their own files to see what could get out that's going to hurt us even more.
So Eric, what do we know about that? What do we know about Democrats' sort of after-action analysis of what might have been captured by these hackers and preparing for the worst?
Well, I've been asking that, and the people I've asked that are saying that it's almost an impossible task to know what could be in you know, tens of thousands of emails that could hurt us. As you know, it only takes one or two embarrassing line, almost a throwaway response to an email, plucked out that can prove incredibly damaging and embarrassing. So I think they're sort of preparing for all possibilities. What we saw today, just at the DNC, is that Donna Brazile is bringing in a whole new panel of cybersecurity experts to prepare for maybe the next attack. Now, that might be a little bit too late. Sort of the horse is already out of the barn, and the damage could already be done by the time they get better defenses in place.
Eric, it's Donnie. Is it safe to say that this is, if this is true, and we will be seeing various emails from 100 Clinton staffers, that it is a harbinger of things to come, that we're all going to have to change the way we communicate? Because you and I both know, and Mark, that if you went into anybody's email and you went through 6 months of personal back and forth, you're going to find things that are just not going to seem right when you read them, even those well-intentioned, decent human being, the way we communicate as people. And this could have tremendous implications for this presidential election, and then going forward, how we communicate as a country and as a universe.
Yeah, I think that is true. There's been that sensitivity certainly for the last few years in Washington. You know, the warning from the lawyers, you know, if you don't want to read it in the newspaper, don't put it in an email. But I think that's becoming much more of a real threat the last few months with these with the DNC hack now being tied to the Russians and the dump from WikiLeaks. And even before that, you saw the Sony controversy last year, where a few emails to and from Sony executives, you know, brought down a number of people.
Mark, I want to ask you a question, and not to do creative writing. What would be the kind of thing that would be a game ender for Hillary Clinton? I mean, that she would be losing sleep, and it's not going to be a turn of a phrase. What would be a worst-case scenario for her?
Well, I mean, I think more meat on the bones of potential interaction between the foundation and the State Department would obviously be a problem, or some sort of quid pro quo regarding income that the family got through speeches or what have you. And as your question suggested, and as I think you see in the latest round of Clinton emails that came out, we've been talking about for the last couple of days, not through hacking, but through the litigation. Sometimes you take strands of things without the context. The Clinton folks are reluctant to supply the context in full, but the context would put a less negative light on what an individual email might show. Eric, since your story came out, has there been any reaction? Has anybody suggested new information that you're going to be publishing in the coming news cycle?
The cybersecurity board that the DNC is putting in place, we mentioned that. No, nothing in terms of specifics arising from the emails yet, but that's obviously what the Democrats are worried about.
Real quick, what is the role now of the FBI and other government agencies now that, in theory, the Russians have what they're going to take? What are they trying to do now as sort of after the fact?
Well, the FBI's main goal is what they call attribution, who was behind this. And they are highly confident, almost to the point of certainty, that it was the Russians, that it was two of the Russian intel services. The question now is really almost a diplomatic one. Will the White House publicly accuse the Russians of being behind this attack, as they've done in a few isolated cases in the past, like with North Korea, or will they just see no benefit to taking that course? The FBI will, of course, then also try and see if they can determine how it was that WikiLeaks came upon these emails. Did the Russian intelligence people give it directly to WikiLeaks, or more likely, were there cutouts, were there intermediaries passed through who then got it to WikiLeaks? And what was the Russians' motive? Was this, in fact, a politically inspired campaign to somehow affect the election, which is a pretty radical idea, to be honest, in terms of Russian intelligence? Or was this just sort of your everyday intelligence gathering, things that they do all the time, except that it normally doesn't become public?
Right. Eric Lukeblatt, New York Times, great story. We look forward to more on this topic coming days. Thank you. Coming up, Donald Trump gets philosophical about winning and losing. We'll discuss that when we come back.
Once I get in, I will do my thing that I do very well. And I figure it's probably, maybe the only way I'm going to get to heaven. So I better do a good job.
Donald Trump addressing a meeting of pastors in Orlando, Florida this afternoon in a sharp departure from the urgency and the I alone can fix it message Trump laid out for the country at his convention speech in Cleveland. Donald Trump now is taking a more ambivalent posture on both winning and losing this general election. He did it this morning in a phone interview with CNBC.
We'll see what happens. happens. I have a whole group of people out there that people don't even know about. You know, I had a rally last night. We had 10,000 people. If Hillary had the rally, she would have had 200 people if she was lucky. So we'll see what happens, but I don't know that it translates into votes. Whatever happens, happens. I'm giving it straight. I don't know that it will work because I'm a non-political person, and I'm proud of that, but I'm giving it straight. Just keep doing the same thing I'm doing right now, and at the end, it's either going to work or I'm going to, I'm going to have a very, very nice, long vacation.
Donnie, this is what Trump said when he first got in the race. Maybe he wouldn't win. Lately, he's been more confident. Do we think this is just a one-off, or is this a window into the mind of the man?
Mark, you and I have talked about this on the Morning Joe. I've said a few times that I know he wants to run and win. I don't know if he wants the job. I asked him that privately once. I didn't get a straight answer. I asked him that once on the air. I didn't get a straight answer. This validates that. It's a silly strategy because it's suggesting that you're on the way to losing. And it's so un-Trump-like. When you're Trump, whatever's going on, it's huge, it's great, I'm winning. And this is so counterintuitive to who it is that it validates my initial point that maybe he doesn't even want this deep down.
Yeah, I think there's a toxic message. He'd be wise to stop it, even if he doesn't want to win. He's got a responsibility to Republicans who nominate him to say, I am going to win. But I do like when our candidates get philosophical, so I give him credit for that. Donnie and I will be right back. Yesterday, Donald Trump held two rallies, one during the day in Virginia, one at night in Florida. They were very different events, not so much in content, but in Trump's tone. It got us to thinking maybe, just maybe, nighttime Trump is more willing to say stranger things.
What they've done to the miners is incredible in the Obama administration.
Barack Hussein Obama.
You know, if you remember with Obamacare, he said you can keep your plane, you can keep your doctor.
He is the founder of ISIS.
I have been all over this country. We have the greatest people anywhere in the world, the greatest people.
How stupid are we?
Really, a big part of the rigged system is the press itself.
The media is rigged. It's rigged. It's crooked as hell.
NAFTA was signed by Bill Clinton. NAFTA is a disaster.
Syrian refugees who people have no idea who they are. They could be ISIS. They're being put next to you in your neighborhoods.
Hillary Clinton will be worse than Obama.
Crooked Hillary Clinton.
She's going to raise taxes in the middle class. You saw that one? Nah, maybe she misspoke. I mean, we have to give him a break.
I don't like her temperament because her temperament is the temperament of a loser.
Tale of two Trumps there. Yeah.
Well done.
Rich
well
Miller.
Done,
Rich Miller has an interesting story on our website, BloombergPolitics.com, about one progressive economist who disagrees with Hillary Clinton's proposed fiscal policies. Coming up on Bloomberg West, Alibaba Executive Vice Chairman Joe Tsai. Thanks for watching. Donnie and I will be back in Gotham City tomorrow, side by side.
Come home. New York
we hope you'll
misses
join
you.
us then. Same bad time, same bad channel. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. Sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's start with a check of your first word news. Hillary Clinton says her opponent Donald Trump spoke only of failure, poverty, and crime in his economic address on Monday. Today at a manufacturing company in Warren, Michigan, Mrs. Clinton said Trump hasn't offered any, quote, credible solutions to America's economic challenges.
Now, when it comes to creating jobs, I would argue it's not even close. Even conservative experts say Trump's agenda will pull our economy back into recession.
Donald Trump has added 7 women to his Economic Advisory Council. The council previously consisted only of men. Some of the names on the list: Diane Hendricks, chairwoman and owner of ABC Supply; Darlene Jordan, executive director of the Gerald R. Jordan Foundation; Betsy McCoy, former New York lieutenant governor; and Brooke Rollins, president and CEO of Texas Public Policy Foundation. There's been no claim of responsibility following twin bombings in Thailand that left 1 person dead and at least 20 others wounded. Authorities say the explosions occurred in the popular seaside resort of Hua Hin. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by our 2,600 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. Bloomberg West is next.
And this is Bloomberg West. Coming up, a millennium milestone in the markets. All 3 major U.S. indexes closing at record highs for the first time this century. We will break down the historic close. Plus, diversification at Alibaba is starting to pay off. We'll hear from the company's co-founder about its push into cloud and media streaming. And a new connection unveiled between the DNC hacks and a series of other hacks targeting investor George Soros and a 4-star NATO general, just to name a few. All the details ahead. First to our lead. For the first time since 1999, the S&P 500, the Dow, and the Nasdaq rose simultaneously to close at record highs on Thursday, all three benchmarks advancing off surprisingly rosy earnings reports. Alibaba helping to lead this momentum, the Chinese e-commerce giant reporting a surge in cloud computing services and its shopping business holding up despite a slowing Chinese economy. Joining me to discuss, our Bloomberg Television editor-at-large, Corey Johnson, and it's interesting, revenue rising. Actually, the biggest jump since the IPO. At the same time, profits dropped considerably. But what did you take away from this?
Yes, look, it's a great big business that is growing at a rapid pace, but that growth is slowing down, and there are signs of weakness around it if you want to look for those things. The sales growth, of course, was there, and they started to break out a little bit more than they had in the past. But fundamentally, I think the thing that really jumped out at me actually was gross margins. Gross margins in decline.